Adrenal fatigue is one of the most misunderstood conditions in medicine. Because, if you get past the dogma that it doesn't even exist, people tend to think of it as simply a problem with the adrenal glands themselves. And certainly the adrenal glands are involved. Cortisol abnormalities are real. Cellular resistance and sensitivity to cortisol is real. But the longer someone's been sick, the more obvious it becomes that this condition is much bigger than the adrenal glands alone. If this were simply an adrenal gland problem, most people would recover relatively quickly once they found the right supplement or glandular or hormone or protocol. Well, that's not what happens. What usually happens is people might improve temporarily, plateau, crash again, improve a little more, and then feel like they're right back where they started. And after a while, that's pretty discouraging because they're doing all the right things, yet their body, it still feels unpredictable. Now, the reason for that is that because prolonged stress physiology, whether it's still present or whether the system is just stuck, it changes far more than just cortisol production. It changes the brain, the autonomic nervous system, the entire HPA axis, sleep, blood sugar, immune problems, mitochondrial energy production, inflammation, hormone signaling, and ultimately the body's overall ability to recover from stress. Now, eventually the body begins operating as though stress and survival, that's the new normal. And once that happens, the symptoms stop looking connected on the surface, even though they're often deeply connected physiologically underneath. And that's why one person can develop insomnia, another develops dizziness, another IBS, chronic pain, anxiety, histamine reactions, brain fog. The symptoms can look completely different on the surface, but that underlying stress response physiology is driving them just the same. Over the years, there are 3 major mistakes I see people make all the time when they're trying to recover. Mistake number 1, focusing only on the adrenal glands. This is the most common mistake. And honestly, it's understandable because the condition itself, it's called adrenal fatigue. It's not my first choice, but it's the best we got for now. So, since adrenal fatigue, naturally, people focus on cortisol because they focus on then adrenal supplements, glandulars, adaptogens, sometimes even hydrocortisone. And sometimes these things can help temporarily, at least in the beginning. But here's the problem. The adrenal glands don't operate independently. They respond to signals coming from the brain and the autonomic nervous system, but in particular the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the limbic system in the brain, the autonomic nervous system. In other words, the brain is constantly assessing how stressful the world currently feels to the body, and then it's yelling at the subordinate adrenal glands to produce cortisol and adrenaline to meet that demand. If the brain and nervous system is still perceiving ongoing stress, overload, inflammation, instability, trauma, poor sleep, blood sugar swings, overexertion, chronic emotional pressure, the adrenal glands will continue responding to those signals. That's why so many people feel temporarily better on supplements, but they eventually plateau or then they crash again. They're supporting the cortisol production chemically while the underlying stress response physiology hasn't yet fundamentally changed. And honestly, one of the biggest clues that adrenal fatigue is not simply an adrenal gland problem is the sheer number of systems that begin malfunctioning once someone develops it. People develop sleep issues, blood sugar problems, exercise intolerance, dizziness when you stand up, palpitations, IBS, brain fog, anxiety, muscle tension, hormone imbalances, histamine problems, immune system problems, chemical sensitivities, pain, you name it, chronic viruses. That's not how an isolated gland problem behaves. And when you step back and look at that broader pattern, it becomes pretty obvious that something much larger is happening physiologically, and that's the brain being involved, the autonomic nervous system being involved, the entire HPA axis being involved. And that system then alters and compromises everything else: immune signaling, digestion, hormones, mitochondrial energy, you name it. Once you understand that, then the treatment approach has to become much broader than simply trying to force the adrenal glands to produce more cortisol. Instead, that focus has to shift towards calming and stabilizing that overall stress response physiology that has been pushed into chronic survival state for too long. Now, mistake number 2 is trying to force recovery too aggressively. This one is also pretty common, especially in high-achieving people. And in fact, most of my adrenal fatigue patients, they were the people who pushed themselves the hardest for the longest before their body hit the wall. So naturally, once they become sick, they try to attack recovery, right? The same way they used to attack their productivity. More supplements, more exercise, more fasting, stimulants, cold plunges, protocols, more effort. The problem is that the body's already reduced energy production on purpose. From the body's perspective, that slowdown is protective. The stress response, that physiology, has determined that the demands being placed on the body exceed the resources available to sustain them safely, so it throttles back, and the body begins conserving energy. The mitochondria become more defensive. The nervous system becomes more reactive. That stress tolerance shrinks, recovery slows down. When that happens, that overachiever tries to override those warning signals and force higher performance anyway. They push. And that can work temporarily, sometimes, especially with cortisol support, stimulants, adrenaline, intense willpower, but eventually we go to the well one too many times. And the crash returns because that underlying physiology has not actually become more resilient yet. The ceiling never truly changed. The person simply pushed beyond it temporarily, and this is where many people get trapped. They try to keep pushing themselves back to health while their physiology keeps responding by pulling on the emergency brake harder and harder. If we learn to live within the parameters our body has set for us, they will gradually broaden. But push beyond, and they tighten up more. Mistake number 3, misunderstanding what healing actually looks like. Most people expect recovery to happen in a straight line. They expect that once they find the right treatment, they should steadily improve week to week, fewer symptoms, more energy. Now, unfortunately, adrenal recovery rarely works that way. Healing usually starts with smaller changes, and they're easy to overlook. I call them small wins. You recover from stress a little faster. Sleep becomes a little deeper. Brain fog lifts for a few hours instead of 10 minutes. You can tolerate stress a little better. Crashes become a bit shorter. And the symptoms start to decrease in intensity, frequency, and duration, even though they still occur. And those changes are important, but because they're gradual, many people just overlook them. Now, we can also be more tired but less wired. So one of the more confusing phases of healing is when patients actually feel calmer and more fatigued at the same time. That sounds contradictory until you understand the physiology. Many people with adrenal fatigue have been running on stress chemistry for years. Adrenaline, hypervigilance, overactivation, fight or flight. When the nervous system finally begins calming down, the person often feels less stimulated overall, and initially that calmer state can actually feel like worsening fatigue. In reality, the body might finally be shifting out of survival mode long enough to begin deeper repair. And this is actually an essential part of healing for some people. But if we don't understand that that's needed, we push ourselves beyond or we pivot in a different direction when all along we were on the right path. Now also, patients will commonly overdo things on good days. Might feel a little better, so we immediately test the limits. And then the symptoms flare again and they assume they've lost all their progress. They haven't, even though the symptoms of the crash are eerily similar to when they first started. But more often, they simply exceeded their current stress tolerance window. And that window does expand over time, but typically much more gradually than people want. Now, the last point I'll mention is about expectations. Healing from adrenal fatigue is unlike healing from any other condition I'm aware of. Our expectations are based on our beliefs and lived experience. And in a culture that is quick fix, impatient, and indoctrinated with one drug for one disease paradigm, well, that may work for infectious disease, but it falls short here. Expectations are also created by perspective. Patients tell me ever since the fill in the blank, divorce, infection, car accident, toxic exposure, trauma, things fell apart. But as we work together, they invariably start to understand the early warning signs that everyone tends to ignore, and they realize that this condition has been building for years, if not decades, which is why it doesn't turn around overnight. And once you understand adrenal fatigue this way, the treatment approach changes completely. The goals stop being simply boost the adrenals. The real goal becomes calming and stabilizing the stress response physiology enough that the body no longer feels trapped in survival mode. That includes improving sleep rhythms, stabilizing blood sugar, reducing inflammation, calming autonomic overactivation, improving recovery capacity, and gradually teaching the body that it is safe to stop conserving all that energy. And that physiology becomes more stable. Energy production, it improves more naturally, not overnight, and not in a perfect line, but progressively over time, those symptoms decrease in intensity, frequency, and duration, and then you slowly become your old self again with increased intensity, frequency, and duration. Mood, cognitive function, stamina, energy. That's what healing looks like. And that's how you get your life back.